Speaker recognizes the honourable member for Stephenville, Port-au-Port.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and certainly great to rise today to speak to Bill number 52. Bill 52, basically an act to amend the Consumer Protection and Businesses Practice Act. Basically what we're doing here under consumer protection, which falls under the mandate of the Minister of Service NL, essentially we're talking about payday loans, as alluded to by the member for Cape St. Francis, as well as our government House Leader and the Minister of Service NL briefly spoke to. First, I guess I'd like to take an opportunity to thank the Minister, as well as his Parliamentary Secretary, the member for Lab West, for their due diligence in working with staff to come up with the legislation with respect to this. It's something I think that's been debated about here in the House before. Certainly, if I'm not mistaken, I know it came up after 2007, again in 2010, and subsequently, I believe even in 2011, there was questions in this House back and forth on particulars around implementing legislation to regulate payday loans. So certainly something very important to talk about whenever we're talking about protecting consumers. And essentially protecting consumers in this province is protecting the people. And extremely important that we have provisions in place to ensure that people are being treated fairly, and that's specifically with respect to finances. Of course, finances are very important to each and every one of us. So again, certainly I want to thank the Minister and his staff for bringing this important piece of legislation. And so whatever the reason anyone might use this service, and be it, as mentioned, that someone may fall on hard times and need to require a loan, perhaps looking for a bit of extra spending money, or certainly could be something to bail them out of a situation. Could be a student requiring additional finances. But whatever the reason anyone uses a loan, the important piece here is that there needs to be regulations around to protect that individual. And so right here, we're not entirely promoting the use of payday loans, but we're looking at the ability to regulate it. This, in terms of protecting consumers, this was something that came up in the mandate letter, I understand, to the Minister of Service NL as well. And part of that would be to take a look at other jurisdictions in the country, and take a look at other provinces in the country, and see what they're doing in terms of protecting consumers across all levels. And so this is just one example of the Minister following through on that mandate letter. In looking at other jurisdictions, as was mentioned, Newfoundland is one of the only jurisdictions that still doesn't have any legislation in place regarding payday loans. So certainly quite concerning, and we don't like to be falling behind the times, if you will, particularly around something as important as this. The payday loan kind of field, if you will, came prominently around the early 2000s, and in 2007 it prompted the federal government to actually amend the Criminal Code of Canada to support legislation around regulating payday lenders, and it encouraged the provinces. It encouraged the provinces at the time to develop their own regulations. And so while most other jurisdictions did put regulations in place, as I say, Madam Speaker, we're certainly one of the last to follow suit. The former administration, I understand, had looked at this and certainly had opportunity to do so. At the time, when they looked into it, I think it was in 2010, they came out and said that they would just certainly at this time leave the industry unregulated. And so it's just an example, alarming to hear on this side of the House, that we had an opportunity under the former administration to implement regulations, introduce legislation around this, around payday loans, and we didn't follow through on it. So this is something that this government notices again. Ironically, it falls under the Minister of Service NL, who is also the Minister for Municipal Affairs. We spent some lengthy time in the House last week and again this week discussing the Procurement Act. And the Procurement Act was just another example of legislation that the opposition had opportunity to introduce and failed to do so. So here we are now, I guess, picking up the ball again, if you will, that they had dropped in terms of not following through on implementing some legislation. So I guess some of the key components here, it's going to allow the lenders of payday loans to be licensed. Right now, these areas aren't entirely licensed, and we're going to be able to impose restrictions and obligations on the lenders So there's going to be a variety of restrictions and obligations on the lenders to ensure that they live up to their commitment in terms of honoring best business practices and protecting our consumers. And I understand that there's some, I think, dozen to 15 or so, somewhere in that vicinity, 12 to 15, could be upwards close to 20 different institutions in this province right now that would certainly fall under this bill as a payday loan lender. And so by licensing them and providing regulations for them to abide by, I also understand that the Minister's Department had consulted with some of these organizations. And we've heard that they're looking forward to regulations. Right now, there's not too many things that are limiting and prohibiting them from what they wish. The Criminal Code of Canada, I believe under section 347, as was noted, would require payday lenders that they wouldn't be able to borrow anything with up to an annual interest rate of 60%. But what we're seeing with these payday lenders is that they're able to kind of circumvent that in some areas. So I think this led to the Department of Justice and Public Safety launching an investigation, and in 2013 they came back and said, well, there was nothing that they could be done at the time due to the best interest of the public. But as a result of that, we now have these organizations and financial institutions and financial lending arms kind of creating their own rules, if you will, to some degree. So I'll give you an example, because I was actually an individual who took advantage of this, one of these payday loan institutions. It wasn't that long ago, just over 10 years ago. I was a post-secondary student here in this province and finding myself in need of a few extra funds, I believe. And I distinctly remember going to one of the payday loan lenders here, and it kind of worked out something like this. Well, you were under the impression and told you would be given X amount of dollars of a loan. If you wanted $100, it may cost you $140. But in addition to that, there'd be a fee. There'd be an application fee. It could be $25. And once you pay your application fee, then there's giving you a debit card. And then there's a charge every time you use that debit card. And then in addition to that, while they tell you that there's an interest rate, could say 20% or more, there might also be a surcharge in addition to that. So by the time you're all said and done, some of the interest rates that were involved in these payday loans could be upwards to 300, 400, 500% in instances. So it's one thing for individuals who need money in a time of, whether again it could be undue hardship, it could be just looking to take on another extracurricular activity, or for whatever reason. But to be completely gouged or misled and misguided in doing so is not fair to the consumer, certainly not fair to anyone. So extremely important that we look forward in moving with this legislation. So under this legislation, we're going to limit the total cost of borrowing. So as I just alluded to, there could be a number of fees captured in the payday loan piece, be it your upfront fee, your application fee, your debit card use fee, another surcharge, the principal of the loan, the actual interest on that principal, so on and so forth. So under this legislation, what we're aiming to do is to capture the total cost of borrowing. So based on a jurisdictional scan, and the minister alluded to that as well in his opening remarks, as did the member for Cape St. Francis, the ranges right now on this total maximum cost from other provinces that have this legislation is somewhere around $15 to $25 per $100 borrowed. So somewhere in that range, I think Ernst & Young had done a report, and they've concluded that $21 would be kind of a key figure we could work with here based on your per $100. So based on that, this is the amount that we're looking at setting as the total cost of borrowing. So that would, in fact, ensure that these loan institutions or financial arms that engage in these payday loans, that would ensure that every other fee they factor in there would be captured in this total cost of borrowing. So there's taking away any of this hidden fees or hidden surcharges. So in addition to limiting the cost of borrowing, we are also going to now require them in this legislation to ensure that the loan agreements are specified. And specified in a sense that we have an exact idea on what the terms are, what the information is going to be in that contract, and the disclosure statements of such. Because a lot of times as most people are aware, when you go to sign financial statements and documents, there's always a fine print, and there's always an extra stipulation, and there's always another piece added on there. So it's an important piece of this legislation is to ensure that these agreements are clearly specified with their terms, their duration, the information, and disclosure statements. We're also going to do, under this legislation, we're going to provide borrowers with a cancellation right. And this is an important piece because you know, I think fair to say I'm certainly guilty of having done this before. Perhaps you might make a decision or engage in a business transaction or a financial transaction, say, oh my God, why did I do that, or should I not have done that, or was you know, kind of a buyer's remorse attitude, if you will, where you had a second thought. So under this legislation, in terms of the cancellation right, it is specified in there, and I'll let the minister speak to it perhaps when we get to the committee stage of the bill. But in essence, it's around you have enough opportunity that if you engaged in a contract for a payday loan and went home that evening, we'll say, perhaps you went home and you had a talk with your spouse or your family, and they kind of decided, in the best interest of the financial situation right now, we should not engage in this payday loan. If you didn't already obviously extract money and use or cash in part of that loan, the specifics in the legislation would allow you, as a buyer's remorse, to go back the following day and to cancel out without penalty. And some of those regulations will come forward in due time, but that's kind of the idea, so that there is a bit of a buyer's remorse situation here, and giving the consumers and the people in this province an opportunity to kind of go back to the institution and speak about this once again. One of the other things we'll be doing with respect to this legislation is making certain payday lender practices to be prohibited. So certain things that they're into now would certainly be prohibited, and providing our borrowers with remedies when the lenders do not honor their responsibilities. So kind of along the same lines of this buyer's remorse attitude, but we'd be making sure that the lenders' practices, you know, certain practices they have now would be prohibited. And when they do not honor their responsibilities, there would be repercussions as well. So I think it's an extremely important piece of legislation. Positions us to set out regulations in this field. Again, something that's not uncommon in other provinces in this country. Some of the other interesting components of this is that you know, we're developing an act that's going to look at some specific terms, and some of the definitions in there, as I said, will probably come through a bit clearer at the committee stage. But as the member for Cape St. Francis alluded to, a maximum term of around 62 days. We're looking at the advancements of 1,500 or less. So, you know, we're kind of putting in certain provisions there, so there's no exorbitant amounts that are lended out, and no real, you know, short terms where there's great strains on an individual and their ability to pay back that loan as well. So again, I think it's certainly an important piece of legislation. I could go on, Madam Speaker, but I do know that the Minister will get a chance to elaborate on some of the bit more details, but certainly something that I'm proud to speak to. I think every time we have an opportunity as government to introduce legislation that's going to protect consumers in our province, we have not only a responsibility, but I think we have an obligation to do so. I think we have an obligation to the taxpayers of our province to do this. I know the Minister of Business would feel the same way when it comes to protection of consumers around any other business transactions, and this is certainly no different. So again, very pleased to see Minister of Service NL, and with the work from the Parliamentary Secretary, as mentioned, the member for Lab West, between the two of them and their staff, to take on this responsibility, and again, take on this as a responsibility, as something that the former administration had every opportunity presented to them to introduce this legislation, and did not do so. And so here we are again, as I mentioned earlier, here we are again, picking up an area where we have not only a responsibility but an obligation to help the individuals in our province and protect them under this under this act. So I look forward to hearing some of the comments from the members opposite as the debate continues. Again, I think we'll probably see cooperation from all sides. I'd certainly be shocked if we did not see cooperation from all sides. something that this side has been asking for quite some time. And within their first year of government, certainly able to capitalize on that and introduce this legislation. Be interesting to hearing support from the third party and our independent member as well. But again, just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak, Madam Speaker, and again, thank you to the Minister for bringing in this legislation. Very timely indeed. Thank you very much.